There are a lot of psychology buzzwords that have been floating around the internet, and some of them are necessary and appropriate, and some of them are not. Trauma bonding is one of those that every single person absolutely has to know what it actually is.
And when you don't know what it actually is, you are the type of person that is getting likely caught in between this one question: is it love or is it trauma? This episode is going to help you discern the difference.
Hey everybody, it's Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Emilia. Bianca and I, just before this episode, we were giggins because I asked Bianca, I go, Bianca, what did they need to know about trauma bonding? Kind of like tongue in cheek. And Bianca says everything. And I, obviously, as someone who loves learning everything, I'm like, hell yeah, let's get into it. But then I said, what's the first step of everything? And she and I went into 5 different components that this episode is intending to addressing, including, and I wrote this down, what trauma bonding is and what it's not, why we get into it or why we get caught up in it, how to recognize when you're in it and the impact that has, and then lastly, how to get out of it. So if you're joining us on this really important episode, please stay till the end to get all 5 of those components. Our ambitions are as large as our hearts. And I'm excited to get into this topic, into this episode with you, Bianca.
That was really cute. I like that.
Which part?
What you just said. Our ambition is as big as our heart. That's cute. I like it.
It's true. It's true.
You're cute. Okay. So Emilia and I, behind the scenes, we obviously keep everything confidential, but she and I are sounding boards for each other when it comes to our work with clients and experiences that we have and experiences that we've seen and the work that we're doing, as every good clinical practice and every good practitioner should have and should be doing. Because if you're not getting the inputs and guidance and peer consultation from the people around you, I don't believe that you're actually doing effective work. I don't think you can really do effective work, because if you're just going off of your own ideas, you're going to think you're great all the time, and you might be missing things sometimes, or sometimes you just need support and validation or just someone to hear you out. So Emilia and I are sounding boards for each other, and we will share anonymously and confidentially each other's cases and what we're working through and the approaches that we're taking and what are patterns that we're seeing and how do we use that to bring it to evolve, to help people and to make this a better place, and what are common challenges that the people in our community are facing. And one of the ones that you and I see so often, and we talked about this a little bit in the previous episode on healing from the guilt of staying in a toxic relationship, is the fact that so many of the people in this community, and so many people, period, are ending up in very disruptive and in very harmful relationships in one way, shape, or form. What I believe the disservice is that is happening is there is not enough accurate information out there about the dynamics of the relationship, what type of relationship you were actually in. Was it a trauma bonded relationship? Is it narcissistic relationship? Is it this? Is it that? Whatever. There's so much misinformation out there. And I believe that people are having such a disservice done to them because they're not actually getting information, real, credible, tangible information as to what these things are and why it's so important for them to know what it is. And so that is my intention for this episode, sincerely, is for every single one of you to walk away from this episode knowing with as close to 100% certainty as possible whether or not you're in a trauma bonded relationship, to even know what that term actually means, not what the internet says it is, but what it actually is based on the data, based on the research, based on the science that's out there. And really to understand what to do if you are in one. Because when you don't have enough awareness, you cannot make effective decisions. And if you don't know what the experiences are that you are having, you are going to be severely hurt by them. And if you clicked on this episode, number one, it's probably because there's somebody in your life that you think is experiencing one. Number two, you think you had one in the past and you want to know for sure. Or number three, you might be in one right now and you're looking for answers. And so that is our sincerest hope for today. So, Emilia, let's start with, unless you have something to add, let's start with question one. What is it? And what is it not?
The only thing that I have to add before we get into this is the encouragement for anyone that is joining us on this conversation, how important languaging is to the doors that we're going to open up in this episode. And I know that for me, having been in trauma bonded relationships, not knowing all of the language that we're going to introduce in here, which I strongly encourage anyone that's listening to this, if there's a word that you don't know or you've never heard before, or you have an adverse reaction to, and you're like, no, it's not that, please, I strongly encourage and invite you to go research what that word is, what it means, and what it means in the context of your experiences. Because when we have the language to name our experiences, we have an increased probability, therefore an increased likelihood that we can work with the problems or the challenges that we face. But if we do not have language to it, we suffer in silence the consequences of a lack of languaging around this. And if you are in a trauma bonded relationship, you and your trauma bonded partner both benefit by going and not having this language. And therefore the trauma bond survives as a result of you not educating yourself around this. And therefore what that actually means in your relationship is that there's more trauma headed your way. Unfortunately, that is the statistics around this. When you do not have the language, you cannot therefore work with it. And if you're not working with it, it is working you. Okay, so we're going to start there. Okay, so what is trauma bonding? Very straightforward. It's an attachment with someone, a person who, I'm going to say commits, and this is going to be strong languaging, but I'm going to use it, who commits acts of control and ultimately power over you such that there is a power imbalance in the relationship, which ultimately results in a violent dynamic between the two of you, to where trauma bonding itself describes the process of consistent power imbalances where control and power play within. And therefore you are quote unquote in love with, and I'm putting air quotes, you fall into this emotional, it could be psychological, it could be financial, it could be sexual, it could be physical, so many different patterns of you being exploited as a result of your vulnerabilities and the traumas that you've experienced and how you're responding to those. I could also put in a nutshell that trauma bonding is essentially an attachment with someone who creates trauma in your central nervous system as a result of what they do and don't do, what they say and don't say. How would you describe it?
How is that different than a normal, quote unquote, or standard, quote unquote, abusive relationship? So, what is the difference between someone who's in a relationship where they are experiencing abuse versus someone who is trauma bonded? What are the nuanced differences in that? Are they different?
Yes. There's very small nuances, almost imperceptible. But from what my training has showcased and told me, is that the biggest nuances when it comes to trauma bonding, you can have abuse within, like abuse is within trauma bonds, like that is inevitable. Trauma bonding doesn't necessarily always show up in abusive relationships, though.
So what's the difference?
So
Because
the
those
bigger
sound the
difference,
same.
of course they sound the same. So the biggest difference from my perspective and based on what I've seen and based on what the research shows that I've been exposed to and worked with is that in the trauma bonding itself, it is a predisposition as a result of that person, what they've experienced, for lack of better words, going into that relationship, not knowing, quote unquote, that there is any sort of abuse going on, and their biological attachment to their trauma bonded person is a result of their predisposition as a result of the trauma imprint, if you will, that they've experienced.
For someone who doesn't have your level of clinical understanding or mine, that sounds almost identical to just regular abuse. So, can you explain a little bit further what trauma bonding means? So, like, what is that process? What is the imprint? How is that different than someone who is just in a toxic relationship?
Okay, pull out if it's not making sense, because to your component, there's a lot of stuff that's in here. But based on what I understand and how I understand it, is that it's like this cycle of so the abuse cycle and the trauma cycle is actually very similar, right? Of course, to a non-nuanced eye or someone who doesn't know it, it does look very similar because abuse happens in cycles. Trauma bonding is that cycle over a longer period of time. But the difference, I would say, is that there's like sprinkles of quote unquote kindness or of emotional needs being met here and there in a trauma bond. This could also be in abuse, but in trauma bond in particular, what happens there is that the trauma itself from the emotional attachment that is being exploited beyond the degree of abuse. And on the perpetrator or the partner that is conducting the violence, they also don't see that as their intermittent connection into that cycle. Both people are shifting into like the victim and the perpetrator role, for lack of better words. That I think that will probably be the best way to describe it. In an abusive cycle, there's one person that's usually the victim and one person that's the perpetrator. And in a trauma bond, it's both people experience both role shifts, where one person is the victim as a result of their trauma, then they go into the perpetrator. The other person in that trauma bond itself is shifting in between their roles as the victim and their roles as a perpetrator. And essentially in those cycles, those two cycles are colliding to create that trauma bond between two people. So if you could picture an infinity sign, an abuse cycle is like, and it's never happening in isolation. So that's why this can be tricky to understand. But if you picture a circle, that's the abuse cycle. There's one person in that cycle that is the perpetrator, the person who's conducting these abusive, whatever they are, be they behaviors, be their emotional exploitation, financial exploitation, sexual behaviors, whatever. But in a trauma bond, it is two people creating complementary cycles that create the trauma bond happening. So you picture two cycles that are interweaving with an infinity sign. So anyone watching this on YouTube, you'll kind of see that. But that's what I want you to picture if you're not watching this on YouTube.
Okay, that made way more sense. So I just chat GPT'd this and it said something very similar to what you said. So trauma bonding occurs when someone becomes emotionally attached to a person who is causing them harm, often due to cycles of abuse, followed by reconciliation or affection. The victim's brain becomes conditioned to the associate becomes conditioned to associate relief from pain when the abuser shows kindness or remorse with love and safety, even though the source of both pain and comfort is the same person. And to your definition, it's interweaving. So one person might be the abuser and one person might be the victim. The other one then might become the abuser and the other one becomes a victim. And there's these cycles that are happening in and out that are causing the bond to expand that much further.
One critical component too that I want to add into that is that it distorts your perception, because the pain and the pleasure principles essentially that were mentioned in that, what happens in a trauma bond is you actually get so distorted as a result of how your dopaminergic systems are synced up. And so what I mean by that, if you have never heard of that system, essentially the feeling good, so the acts of kindness, or in an emotional abuse cycle, this is where the after the discarding happens, then there's that quote unquote love bombing or breadcrumbing in the cycle, right? And so like that's when the dopamine comes out, where you feel significant, you feel good. So you're like, as a victim, you get distorted in your perception as a result of literally the chemical components that are happening. That's why I said earlier, a little bit less directly, your brain, your chemical change, it like you're literally getting wired in a trauma bond. But the reason why you're getting wired in the way in which you are, the reason why you become a victim of that trauma bond itself, is because of the trauma that you experienced in your past predisposed your dopaminergic pathways to attach to a person who is naturally going to exploit you or to bring you trauma. And that's where the cycle consistently stays. And it's so important to know for people who are in trauma bonds to know that what happened to you way before this person is what predisposed you to that attachment in the first place.
100%.
Does that also make sense?
Yep, that makes perfect sense. I have a client that I'm thinking of right now who she experienced severe abuse at the hands of her father when she was growing up. He never put his hands on her, but she watched him violently beat and abuse her mother. And then the father after would come back and buy her flowers or do something like that in the aftermath as a way of apologizing. So the very first...
I want to pick that apart, Bianca, because for anyone listening to that, when you're a child and you observe abuse happening, because your central nervous system is synced up to your caregivers, you're having to bear witness to that essentially communicates to your central nervous system that the safety signals that are going off, where mom's getting her ass whooped, for lack of better words, not to be insensitive, but in that situation, the power dynamic that dad has is through violence and aggression. So her central nervous system is getting synced up to violence and aggression is actually love, because dad then brings me flowers and everything is fine afterwards, which is exactly that distorted perception of what love actually means. And that's what then predisposes her. Sorry to jump in, but I want to break each chunk down for our listeners as they hear what you're saying, because it's really difficult to put the link in. What happened there is what got me into here, and now I'm staying here. So how do I, so please keep going. Super critical to break it down though. Play by play.
Hello everybody, my name is Derek Smith. I just wanted to come on here and talk about my time at Evolve. It's been nothing short of phenomenal, and I don't say that as somebody just trying to hype up the team or the business or anything like that. No, it's genuine, and like genuinely, I've never been a part of such a group, had people that were so invested in me, being able to keep me accountable, and like pushing and really just supporting me for my own growth. And the amount of things that I've been able to help and influence, manage in myself, learn about, and just being a part of this community, all under the guidance of Bianca and Emilia, for me that's just been phenomenal. So my time here has just been very, very blessed. So thank you, Emilia. Thank you, Bianca. You guys rock.
So she saw her mother be abused, and then she saw her father never apologize, but he would come home and bring the mother flowers, or he would take them out somewhere, or they would go to dinner somewhere, or whatever, something like that. So she never experienced a healthy relationship in any way, shape, or form up to that point. The first relationship she ever ended up in was with someone who is exactly like her father. And the story that she told herself was, well, that's what I deserve. I'm not that's what happens to women. That's what happens to us. That's love. That's all that's meant for me. So she ends up witnessing violence and then ends up in a relationship where that same exact pattern is now being replicated, except she's also now contributing to that, and now both of them are causing harm to each other.
So if you haven't, so what you just described there is intimate partner violence, which again, the power and control and balance of her father then had her mother at a lower power position, and therefore higher control was induced as a result of that, because he didn't see her mother as equal to, which is what unconsciously comes and happens in this dynamic of intimate partnerships, right? As opposed to a belief system that my partner is my equal inherently, right? Her time is as valuable as mine. Her contributions are just as valuable as mine in the intrinsic world. And as a result of that power and control dynamic, that then set her belief system up with a deservancy factor that's at a level 2 out of what could be a level 10. But any level 10, she's going to automatically create this psychological immune system to anyone that's above what her father essentially represented in the control and the power dynamics, so that any violence that comes into her relationship in this power dynamic is obviously normal and okay. Now, that's the psychological distortion that is so detrimental in a trauma bonding intimate relationship, because IPV, intimate partner violence, is essentially what allows the perpetrators to continue their behaviors that are by inherent measure abusive, violent, and exploiting of someone who is vulnerable. And then what happens with that is that the person who's a victim then becomes a perpetrator, because at the end of the day, all they have left at their disposal is essentially to lash out and operate within their firefighters and their protectors to try to gain a semblance of control and of power back restored within their nervous system. And so that sets any couple up for this an eye for an eye, we all go blind type mentality. You do this, so I'm going to do that mentality. And it just comes into this like really messed up chemical imbalance of what we believe love to be, which if you then continue that and never actually admit or acknowledge that there's actually like a lot of neuroscience that's underneath what we're saying here, that actually starts to trickle into short and long-term health. So to some of the things that we ambitiously said in this episode, implications of when you're in a trauma bond. Bianca, talk to me about what you've observed. It could be that client or other clients. Some of the implications of their being in a trauma bonded relationship in terms of their behaviors, and then the implications of how they've shown up then now in that trauma bond, receiving the perpetrating experiences of their partner.
We discussed this a little bit in the previous episode, but when you are in that dynamic, there's a lot of data and a lot of science to show that your brain basically becomes hooked to this relationship as if you were on heroin or cocaine or a very, very high potency stimulant or drug. So your brain is literally getting hooked on the highs and lows that are happening in the relationship dynamic, as if you were chasing a high or chasing a fix of a literal drug. So what happens when our brain basically is telling us we're on drugs and that this person is my pain, but they are also my pleasure. They are my only sense of reconciliation. So this person is the one that's hurting me, but they're the only one that can fix it. Just like substances of abuse. I have a lot of clients who have had family members who were addicted to substances, or who they themselves were addicted to substances. And it's like, this drug is ruining my life and I see the consequences of it, but this drug is the only thing that can fix the pain that I'm in. So you end up just like perpetuating a cycle over and over again. What are the long-term implications of that? We had a group coaching session where you showed the brain and the differences between a child whose brain suffered trauma through like being abused at home or from witnessing abuse, and a healthy brain. Your brain literally deteriorates. So parts of your brain start shrinking, they start collapsing, they literally start dying off because of the trauma that you are experiencing in this relationship. Your health severely, severely declines. Many people who experience abuse end up developing long-term medical diagnoses like cancer, like degenerative nerve diseases that end up causing something like Alzheimer's or dementia. They end up experiencing things like multiple sclerosis. They end up developing things like cardiovascular disease, nerve damage, endocrine system damage, adrenal system damage. It causes literal physical health consequences. Not only that, you end up, the core beliefs and the way that you view yourself, the world, and other people radically changes to where this person is my pain, but this person is also my pleasure. So now you start removing anyone and everything out of your life that's going to try to pull you away from this person.
Villainize
You're being
them.
Villainize
Instead
them,
of
exactly.
seeing objectively that they are actually a lifeline for you.
Yep. You end up experiencing more cycles of abuse with this person. It could ruin your jobs. It can ruin your education and your careers. It severely negatively impacts every single aspect of your life to a far more degree than I think anybody wants to admit.
Not only that, but what I've also seen is and all of that is really wild to see, because when we're in it, there's one cognitive distortion that essentially it's like this happens to everyone else but not me. And when you're in a trauma bonded relationship, and if you're listening to this, that's happening on an unconscious level. Your cognitive distortion that's saying, yep, that happens to everyone else, but that's not my situation. And I encourage you to eat the humble pie that it is actually your situation, and you're going to be better off learning about it. We're not saying you have to do anything about it, but just learn about it so that at least you can pick up on the signals, because not only do those implications happen as a result of literal volume in your brain, parts of your brain shrinking, other parts of your brain getting enlarged, like for example, your amygdala, that fear center, that gets enlarged during trauma bonding because of the actual neurochemistry that's getting involved, which then syncs you up to higher cortisol level seeking behaviors. So then you're more willing to take risk situations and see them in a distorted perception. So like, let's say, for example, I've heard people in trauma bonded relationships, they end up getting, as a result of that trauma bonding, they end up actually making the decision to have unprotected sex with their partners. They end up pregnant with a child who's now in the mix of a decision. And it just so happens to be a baby trap of the other partner, the perpetrator, because that other partner is terrified of having to lose this relationship. And so then now there's a child in the mix. So it's not just, all doom and gloom, but there's also these really bright spots that could quote unquote happen that are seemingly bright, but are actually incredibly unfortunate circumstances, because you are not at a biochemical level to be able to meet the needs of what could be a really bright spot in someone's life. Right. And unfortunately, then other risky behaviors like I've heard clients who have their partners now stalking their social media accounts, completely stalking who they text, who they call, controlling behaviors like that start to come out. I've also seen financial exploitation come into the mix where there's been complete control and power dynamics at play in the finances. I remember this one specific woman when I was going through my trauma cohort. She was in a trauma bonded relationship and she was in her 50s, and she was with this man who she was trauma bonded with, and literally like washed her entire bank account because of the fact that he was controlling her finances. That the control and the power dynamics started to spread into every area of their life, and on both ends. What is seen as a very risky situation to anyone that's objective and in a quote unquote right mind, which what I mean by that is simply not in the chemical imbalances that when you're in a trauma bonded relationship, you have, to where someone's life savings has gotten completely washed out, to even sexual exploitation. And this might seem all doom and gloom, but these are real people in the real world that are likely in the same neighborhood as you, that are likely going through a very similar stage in life. And if you're a student or if you're someone in your teen era, right? Unfortunately, some of the narratives that get cloaked in what is happening is, no, this person loves me, or it's cloaked in this really kind, loving, right, in air quotes, narrative of I'm doing this for you. And unfortunately, that's the gaslighting that can happen in these trauma bonded relationships that have these control and power dynamics at the very seat of it. And really, when you pull all of that away, it's really unfortunate. Like I said, I've been in one too, so I know what it feels like. And you're not a bad person if you're in a trauma bonded relationship. I do feel as though I need to say that kind of as we wrap this out, because one of the biggest things that trauma bonding can induce is a lot of shame. And so you actually isolate yourself to where you never actually get help. And therefore that I'm a bad person narrative really starts to take hold of you in those chemical imbalances, which can then really lead to some horrible consequences down the line, to where I've even heard some people have successfully completed suicide as a result of that. And that, that's an extreme, but it's becoming more common, unfortunately, because people refuse to get help in situations like these.
It's the reality, or they get addicted to actual substances, or, they stay in the relationship because they've isolated everybody out of their lives. It is severe, and it is as bad as people like don't want to believe. And yeah, you could get into it too. It might also be you. You're not, for anyone who's like, yeah, but it's not that bad, and well, they really love me, and well, if I really loved them, I would stick it out. That's the trauma bond narrative. That's
Literally.
the abuse narrative. So how do people get out? Because you and I have seen so many people who are in these relationships where, like, no matter what we say, no matter what we do, no matter how much we try to help, there's almost no pulling them out of it. And unfortunately, there are women and men and people in general who end up in trauma bonded relationships who, till death do us part, they're in it until, as awfully as you just said, one of them completes suicide, or they end up staying together for the entirety of their lives. So,
which always ends up shorter and riddled with like so many different mental health diagnoses. I can't even go. So the first how, I'm going to end and I'm going to die in this hill. Go get professional help. Go seek someone who is an unbiased. And I said this in the last episode because this is the straightest path that I could serve anyone without being like, yeah, it's just straightest path. Go get professional help, because someone that's a friend or a family member has no idea how to help you. And more often than not, they indirectly have contributed to why you're in the situation where you are now. I'm not saying cast blame, but go get professional help. Sync with someone that is trauma informed, who understands the actual neurochemistry that's involved, because you can't just wish things away. There's actual chemical imbalances that you're working with. So someone that has an understanding in the neuroscience, in how the brain changes so that they can set you up on a path that is actually sustainable. Because like all addictions, anything that's not sustainable is just going to have severe implications otherwise. So we're talking about emotional, social, psychological, physical, mental, financial, so many different components that are attached to this. And so that attachment needs actual professional help, not someone who pretends like they could be that ear that you can lean on whenever you feel like you need actual professional help. And that's all I can say at this point, because I know saying anything else other than that is doing our community a disservice. Bianca,
Well said.
what's your first how-to?
Ditto.
If anything other than that.
Ditto.
Yeah.
You cannot change them. To the last episode we did, you cannot change them, and you can't change yourself when you're in that. That's like saying I'm going to stop my addiction while still shooting up heroin. It's like it's impossible. It is literally impossible.
Yeah.
If you or anyone that you know you believe is experiencing something like this, call for help. Try, send them this episode, or maybe not. I don't know. They might not be receptive to it, but help is out there. Help is out there. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean that you're betraying this person if you ask for help. You're betraying yourself by staying in a situation where you and or the other person are being abused. And that does more of a disservice to the world than anything else. That is more of a betrayal than anything else. And you need you, and there's people who need you, and this is how we stop doing stuff like this, to get educated. That's the first step. So
first step. Cool.
What is your episode suggestion?
My episode suggestion in closing, because we have to pop to a call right now, 360, the real reason why we self-sabotage. Bianca?
438, understanding trauma responses you mistake as personality. All right, everybody. We hope this episode was incredibly informative. Please reach out if you are struggling with this, or if you know somebody who is. And we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.